Hello, I'm Norcott-Mahany, and I will be going through the first part of Chapter 2 of Maurizio's Classical Mythology in Context. So, the first part, Section 1, 2.1, they call it history. What they're doing is they're giving you some background information, and some is historical stuff, some is stuff about the gods and their rituals. And they also have a selection from a Greek work. In this case, we have the entire Theogony as we have it of Hesiod. So, Hesiod's Theogony means birth of the gods, is creation stories, focuses on the Greek creation story. So this would be the equivalent of Genesis. Creation stories are part of every oral culture to explain why the world is the way it is. They look back to the way, things started, right? So the way things started, the structure of the world as it started sets the pattern for the rest of the world. The world as we know it. It sets the ethical, social, and religious patterns for a society. Now, that stuff is somewhat in flux, but within an oral society, they would be hearing these stories, the sort of same stories or variations of the same stories over and over and over again. And of course, that is going to, really help to settle in your mind a particular way of acting. Ritual behavior, social behavior, how do you act in society, and ethical behavior, your own personal ethics, are all going to be sort of formed by those stories. When I was growing up, even though the story has since proven to, in fact, be not historically accurate, the story of George Washington not telling a lie, or Abraham Lincoln also being quite honest, it meant a lot to me as a kid, and I think informed my own views of honesty. They provide explanations of the order of society. So Greek myths come from a patriarchal society, so a society where men are running things and women often have little or no voice, and the myths are often going to sort of reflect that in some way, and you'll see that a little bit in the Theogony itself. So the artwork that's shown here, this is a side from a marble sarcophagus from the 3rd century CE, so fairly late, so 200s AD in the old dating system. We have Prometheus, who is this figure seated here. Right, this figure right here is Prometheus, and he is molding human beings out of clay. So he's got one on his lap, and then he's got another one standing on a little pedestal. And then the figure that to the right of the figure on the pedestal, that's Athena. And the way we know that's Athena, it's a female figure, right? She's wearing a female's like gown, and she has on a helmet, right, which women don't generally wear, but Athena almost always has a helmet on, and she's got the aegis of Zeus, which she wears sort of as a breastplate, and on it is the Medusa head, right? And you can see the Medusa head right here. So the story was that Prometheus created human beings out of clay. So Zeus is not the creator of humans, but Prometheus is the creator of humans. Now, whether Hesiod knew that story, that I do not know. And in fact, I don't think we can say from the text whether he knew it or not. He certainly doesn't provide much justification for why Prometheus helps humans. Later authors certainly developed this idea that it was Prometheus who created humans, therefore who was sympathetic to humans. Hesiod's Theogony. This is one of 2 works attributed to Hesiod. There were other works that were attributed as well. The Shield of Heracles is one of them. Those works are pretty much they're not by Hesiod. And some people think that the author of the Theogony is not the same as the author of the Works and Days. Both use the word Hesiod, the name Hesiod, to refer to the author. So the author sort of speaks every now and then in first person and uses the name Hesiod. This would have begun as oral poetry. In fact, Hesiod's Theogony is a good example of oral poetry. Now, we're reading this in a sort of prose translation, so you're going to lose some of that. But the Theogony would, if you read the work aloud, would take about an hour to read. And an hour to 2 hours would be an evening's entertainment, and so that sort of is fitting, right? You can imagine a poet could get up and could recite something like the Theogony. Now, the form that we have it, the way it's organized, that may have happened later, so we may have bits and pieces that are stitched together. We really can't tell exactly, but Hesiod, it's wrong in a sense to think of Hesiod as a author in the modern sense of the word. What Hesiod's presenting is not necessarily original with him. He's presenting the tradition. Now, he may be adding some stuff that is his, but it would be tough to sort of figure out what that would be. It was recorded, it was set down in writing sometime in the Archaic period. Now, the Archaic period runs from 780 to 490. That's usually the time frame that they give, BCE. Now, Homer, as far as I can tell, was recorded, the text we have of Homer was recorded sometime around in the 500s, like 525 or so, 530 BCE. And it's possible that Hesiod's works were also set to writing at that point. But they were composed earlier. These works were composed sometime in the 8th century, the 700s BCE. So, many scholars assume that Hesiod is more fiction than fact. They're talking, in a slide here, they're talking about the figure of Hesiod. Hesiod says some stuff about Hesiod in the Theogony, that he was a shepherd, that the muses appeared to him, and that basically the muses gave him his poetic gifts. That story, my guess is probably the Hesiod who tells the Theogony probably used that as his intro, the same way that John Denver might open with, "Thank God I'm a country boy." Doesn't mean that John Denver really was a country boy, nor should we assume that the Hesiod presented is actually the poet himself. This is certainly is the facade, certainly the character he is adopting to sell the poem. All right, so the work is not considered sacred in the way that the Bible is considered sacred or the Quran is considered sacred. I mean, that's what when they talk about not considered sacred, that's what they really mean. So here we have a red figure amphora. Amphora has two handles, right? Amphora means ears on both sides, so those are the handles. This shows a lyre player. Actually, he's not really playing a lyre. He's got what's called a cithara, which is bigger than a lyre, but he's playing the stringed instrument. So this would be the ancient equivalent of the guitar. A poet like Hesiod would either accompany himself on the lyre or he would have a performer who would play the lyre. So think of Hesiod's work as song, something like folk songs, right? If you think of like folk music, right? Singer-songwriters, that type of thing. That's sort of the way we should think of Hesiod and Homer as far as how their works were performed. And there may even have been dancers. In Homer, there's a reference to dancers accompanying the singer while the singer sings the song, which, adds a whole different level, but we don't know in the case of Hesiod. Hesiod, though he lives in the Iron Age, he is writing about the Late Bronze Age, the period called the Mycenaean Age, which runs from 1600 to 1100 BCE. And all of the heroic stories, the stories about heroes, take place in the period from about 1400 to about 1100. The stuff in the Theogony is before that because it deals with the creation. So it deals before, like, humans, or before you have really societies to speak of. Mycenae, the reason it's called the Mycenaean Age, it was the most important Bronze Age settlement in Greece. It was the largest, and Mycenae probably controlled most of southern Greece. So it controlled a large region, much larger than later Greek city-states. The Mycenae itself was a fortified settlement, so it had a wall around it. It was basically the castle of a warlord. The Wanax is a warlord, so the king as warlord. It was located on a hilltop because you want to build your city on a hill so you can see the enemy coming. Also, they have to run up the hill. You're shooting arrows and spears at them as they're coming up the hill. It's a better position to be in. And so this picture is in your book, and you can see there's a map laid out by archaeologists showing the citadel with the wall around it. The wall is in orange. Here's a map of ancient Greece. You can see Mycenae is located here in southern Greece, and it probably controlled most of this area here. Pylos was independent, so it didn't go that far. The city of Askra is the city that Hesiod in the Works and Days says he is from. It's a rural area, sort of in north central Greece. Athens is over here, it's sort of in the eastern part of Greece. This area that Askra is in is called Boeotia, means cowland. So it's a much more fertile area for cattle and so forth than much of Greece. Much of Greece, the way I like to, pitch it is, when you think of Greece, think of Utah with beaches, because it's got a lot of sea, but it does not have a lot of water. It's basically like a near desert community. So a little more about Mycenae. The communities in Mycenae had complex social and economic networks. The city-states had to work together. They would have treaty arrangements and so forth. There were roads, fairly basic roads, but there were some roads. Farmers and herders pay taxes in kind, right? So it's not as much a monetary thing. They would, if you're if you have sheep, then you give a certain number of sheep to your lord, or a certain amount of wool to your lord. If you're a farmer, you give a certain number of vegetables to the lord, and so forth. All classes served in the army. It wasn't quite a feudal society, but if there was a war, everyone was expected to take part. The poorest people would be things like slingers, the guys who had slingshots, because they couldn't afford the equipment. Archers also, they need the bow and arrow, but they don't need body armor. Body armor is very expensive, and then if you're cavalry, of course, you're from the upper class, because you have to be able to afford and keep a horse. Slavery was common. Slavery was common throughout the ancient period. I mean, slavery still exists in the Christian period when Christianity takes over. There's still slavery going on. The Bronze Age settlements start to disappear sometime after 1200 BC. So around 1200 BC, that's around the time of the Trojan War. I think that the Trojan War seems to have happened. If it was a long war, like a 10-year war as presented by Homer, if it was a long war, if the leaders of the communities were away at war for much of the time, for 10 years, a dozen years, but a long period, what would happen is the people would start to get restless. The people who had been left behind to rule might start to lose control. And I think that's sort of what's going on. So while the leaders are away, troubles are happening at home. The ancients said that there was a second invasion of Greece by a group called the Dorians, the Dorian invasion. That may or may not have happened. Other people refer to the Sea People. There was some sort of invasion. But if there was, I think that just took advantage of a situation where you had these city-states weakened by a long war, and then they started to fall apart. And here we have a terracotta statue from around the time that the Theogony and Works and Days were composed, 7th century, well, a little bit later than that, but in the ballpark. The Iron Age and the city of Askra, the town of Askra. The Iron Age is named after its use of iron for tools and weapons. The Bronze Age, they're using bronze weapons and armor. Obviously, iron is tougher, but iron is less glamorous, right? So bronze looks nice, but iron is tough, so iron makes better weapons, it makes better plows, and so forth. The early Iron Age, the period sort of around 1000, so after the fall of the Mycenaean world, up to the time that Hesiod and Homer are composing, that period is called the Dark Ages. There is no literacy during that time period, and so we don't have any records from that time period. What we have some records from the late Mycenaean period that seem to be largely lists of possessions, sort of tax information, that type of thing, not inventories, not literature. So literature even then was probably oral and not written down. But there was some literacy. In the Dark Ages, there's no literacy. There's a complete economic collapse of the society. These great big citadels basically fall apart. People start taking parts of them to build like smaller communities. So what you've got is a sort of like a Great Depression that extends over a period of 300 years. The Hesiod's Works and Days is composed at the end of this period, so sometime between 800 and 700, when Greece starts to come in contact with the Phoenicians, and they start to send out colonies around the Mediterranean. So the Greeks actually start building cities in Italy and Egypt and Asia Minor during this period. So as they come in contact with other cultures, then they start to develop their own literature. The Works and Days, which is a farmer's almanac with stories, is basically what it is. It talks about days to plant, it talks about days to harvest, it talks about how you build a wagon, but it also has stories in it, like, for instance, the story of Pandora is in the Works and Days. There's also a version of the Pandora story in the Theogony. And that, of course, sets up, like, why is human life so tough? Well, it's because humans disobeyed the gods, and then Zeus ordered a woman to be created, Pandora, and Pandora brought all these evils that she let out of a jar. Now, the Works and Days, Hesiod poses, he presents himself as a farmer whose brother, Perses, because he was older, and also because he bribed some judges, the implication is, was able to get the family farm. But Hesiod is a better farmer than his brother, and this is basically sort of composed as advice he's giving to his brother on how to farm as best you can. Now, was Hesiod a farmer? Probably not. I mean, oral poets, you pretty much have to grow up to be an oral poet. You have to grow up in that tradition. So if you're an oral poet, what usually happens is, you're a kid, 5 years old, 6 years old, you go to a festival. At the festival, there are oral poets. When you get home, maybe you're able to imitate the oral poet. Maybe you're able to remember whole stretches of what the poet sang, or bits and pieces. And your parents say, hey, this kid looks like he has some ability. Then you would take your kid to the local oral poet, the town's oral poet, or to the guy who's going through town on a tour, and say, hey, I think my kid has some talent. The poet would sort of check the kid out. If it looked like the kid could become an oral poet, he would become an apprentice to the oral poet. And then by the time he got to be, 20 years old or so, he would be performing himself, and gradually he would have his own students under him. So that's how you become an oral poet. So you have to sort of do it from when you're really young. So Hesiod's pose as a farmer here, and in the Theogony as a shepherd, both of those seem like setups. They don't seem like they'd be accurate. I mean, he may have come from a farming family, or he may have come from a shepherding family. They wouldn't be the same. Shepherds and farmers did not do the same thing. They would not be the same. You would not do the same in the same family. At any rate, he says at any rate that their family estate is in Askra, and that Askra is basically, the sticks. It's this rural outpost. His description of Askra is backed up by the archaeological record. Well, at around 800 BCE, which is sort of the time period he's talking about, even if he's composing around 750, he's really looking back to the very end of the Dark Ages. You're still in economic collapse. All right, every place is going to be pretty much crappy, and so that's not surprising. The kings have lost central authority. What you have, the people that are called kings in the Works and Days are really like village chieftains. Most residents are small independent farmers. So you have like small communities, maybe 10, 15 farms that are gathered together into like a small community, but you don't have any like large city-state as you had in the Mycenaean period. One of the things that happens at the beginning of the Archaic period is the creation of the temple complex at Olympia and the Olympic Games. So the Olympic Games were held at Olympia, which is in southern Greece, southwestern Greece, and there was a great temple of Zeus there, and every 4 years they held an athletic contest for all of Greece to participate in. I think you had to be a Greek speaker. You didn't have to be Greek necessarily. And you would take part in the festival and in the one of the competitions. And if you were successful and won an event, what you would do is you would hire a poet who would actually sing a praise song about you as a great runner or a great charioteer, that type of thing, and maybe compare you to some mythological figure. So towns in the Archaic period are beginning to develop. You're actually getting actual city-states again. You're not quite as wealthy as they had been in the Mycenaean period, but getting wealthier. Trade is certainly helping. Now, this thing over here says, as kings gained more power and became tyrants. That's really, I don't like that. Tyrants are not kings. Tyrants are people who have king-like power, but who take that power. Now, tyrants are not necessarily bad. They're sort of like city bosses. And city bosses could get things done, and sometimes could get things better, done better than what they had before. But tyrants, you are a king if you are the son of a king. If you take power, you were not born to the purple, then you are a tyrant. Okay, so they're two separate things. Greek city-states develop into a collective identity as a demos, as a people. So it's in this period that Athens is starting to really get a sense of itself, and by 500 Athens will become a democracy. But at this point, Athens is under, probably at kings around 800, but by 600 or so, they are under tyrants. The kingship has sort of fallen apart, and tyrants have taken power. The Archaic period and Pan-Hellenism. So the Hellenic identity, the identity the Greeks had that they were Greeks, that even though Spartans don't like Athenians and Athenians don't like Spartans, they both agree that they are Greek, and therefore both of them are better than barbarians. Right? So that identity develops during the Archaic period. And partly because you have these pan-Hellenic festivals, right? The Athenians are visiting Sparta, or they're visiting Olympia, or they're visiting Delphi, and they're meeting people from other parts of Greece, and they're realizing that these people from far other places are actually somewhat like themselves. They speak the same language, if in slightly different, in some cases very different dialects. This concept of Hellenic identity was maintained by the pan-Hellenic sanctuaries. So Olympia, Delphi would be the main ones, and festivals that were held where everyone would go. Oral performances of works by Homer and Hesiod. developed a shared understanding of gods and goddesses. We know that in Athens, at a festival called the Pan-Athenaic Festival, the main one was held every 4 years, but there was a smaller one held every year. And at least at the one held every 4 years, and maybe at the one held every year, the Iliad and the Odyssey were recited from memory. Now, these are not by poets like Homer. These are people who've basically memorized Homer and are presenting Homer. But they do know it, down to a T. And my guess is they could adjust it based on the crowd. But they're not oral poets. But that performance, that would be a big thing. Hesiod in north central Greece, so Delphi in areas in Thebes, in that area, would have been definitely recited there, and gradually maybe over more of Greece. And we know from later authors that Homer and Hesiod pretty much set the template for the Greeks when they think about their gods. They think about them largely in terms of Homer's and Hesiod's presentation of the gods. So this led to a gradual homogenization of belief and worship. Belief maybe not. Worship maybe not, but belief, they certainly have a sense of the gods based on what Homer and Hesiod present. There, of course, are local variations on the traits and the worship of the gods. So at Delphi, which was an oracle of Apollo, Apollo there is presented pretty much solely as an oracle figure, right? He predicts the future, and less so other aspects of Apollo. Alternative creation stories. So there are other creation stories even within the Greek world besides Hesiod's Theogony, but they're much later, and so they're a bit of a problem as far as like determining what would they have believed. So philosophers of the Archaic period, so philosophy starts to kick off in the 700s, they imagined that there was some sort of process that created the universe. So these philosophers said things like, everything came from fire, everything came from water, everything came from earth, and then it sort of morphed. So it's a sort of physical, almost scientific, in a sort of mythic way, process, rather than necessarily believing in the gods. The Orphic creation stories have gods that are not found in Hesiod. So in the Orphic story, the world sort of comes out of a cosmic egg. So it hatches out of an egg. There's the world. And there's a god called Phanes, who's a god of light. And there are other gods as well. Cronus, which spelled the way it is here, Chronus, means time. And that is not the same as Cronus, as we'll see him in the Theogony. No H, it's a different word and a different name. So here we have a little marble relief medallion showing a young divinity, perhaps Phanes, because he's holding his torch. So this god of enlightenment, this god of light. All right. So the Theogony. The Theogony is a work of about 1,000 lines. It's about 30 pages. It would take you about an hour to read it aloud. So if you read it aloud, that's about how long it would take. Hesiod was instrumental in shaping the Panhellenic ideas of the gods. He and Homer both are sort of seen as setting the template. The Theogony was a collection of oral poems. So there are different types of poems in the Theogony, and the work is sort of stitched together. But it's stitched together pretty well, so it may very well have been conceived in this form, when it got written down, when it actually got committed to writing. So there are hymns. There are only a couple of hymns. There's a hymn to the Muses. So this is a song of praise. And then later in the poem, there's a hymn to the goddess Hecate, who's a goddess generally associated with the underworld. She's generally portrayed as an old woman, so she's the crone figure. There are catalogs, and so you've got like a list of the daughters of Ocean. You've got a list of the various females that Zeus mated with. You've got a figure of mortal men that goddess is mated with, right? So you get these catalogs. Now, the thing about catalogs, to us, they seem sort of bizarre. They don't advance the plot. They're just this long sort of like list of names with some descriptors. And you might think, well, like, gee, this would get sort of boring just to listen to these. And if you've ever read the Bible, there are passages that they refer to as the begats, where you have like a whole list of so-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so. Well, it does serve, in the Bible, it serves a function. It takes you from the origin story, from the creation with Adam and Eve, up to the time of Jewish history, when there's actually history that they can count on. But another thing that catalogs do, catalogs are where poets show off their stuff. Because catalogs are a list of names, there's a lot of names, it would be very easy to drop a name or forget a name, or put a name in there, and because of the metrical pattern, be unable to complete the line. So you'd botch a line. So the line has a metrical pattern, and every line should go smoothly to the next line. If that doesn't happen, if there's a botch, like some sort of slip up, then the poet's got a problem. So catalogs are more likely to be those areas where a poet would have a problem, and that's why I think these were the showstoppers. When a poet was performing orally and he was going into a catalog, that's when he said, when he showed off, hey, I can do this. I can go on for the next 5 minutes just tossing off names. And the audience is sort of waiting for, like, when's this guy going to drop it? Just like when you're watching a juggler. When's the guy going to drop the ball? Okay, that's the sort of thing. And then dramatic tales. So there are tales that are told in the city, so in the theogony. So you've got, for instance, Cronus usurping the throne from his father Uranos, the sky god. So Uranos means sky. His son Cronus usurps the throne because he's been abusing Mom. Gaia means earth. And so Cronus takes over. He rules for a while. Then he gets overthrown by Zeus. And there's the Titanomachy, the battle between the Titans, led by Cronus, and the gods, led by Zeus, to see who will come out on top. Of course, spoiler alert, it's going to be the gods over the Titans. Now, the Titans are just an earlier version of gods, but the Olympian gods are the ones who are going to win. And you've got the story of the theft of fire and the creation of Pandora. Although in the Theogony, she is not given the name Pandora. She is just a female that is created at Zeus's command as a trap for men. As you read this, think about how this shows the Greek understanding of the world, how the world works. Okay, hymns. Meant to be recited aloud. Well, everything needed to be read aloud. I mean, in fact, even when there was literacy, and by the time of the Romans, pretty much, most of the population had some degree of literacy in the Greco world and the Roman world, but and anyone who had any education at all would be able to read texts, but people generally didn't read their texts. If you were wealthy enough to be literate, to really know literature, you were wealthy enough to have a slave who would read the works to you. So even when there was literacy, works were read aloud. In fact, we know from as a fact that the first mention of someone reading silently happens in the writings of St. Augustine. So St. Augustine, when he met St. Ambrose, of course, when they met, neither of them were saints, but Ambrose was the Bishop of Milan. Augustine was at that time not even a Christian, but he was sort of thinking about becoming a Christian, and he meets Ambrose, and Ambrose is sitting in front of a book. And Augustine says, what's this guy doing? And he actually says to Ambrose, what are you doing? And he says, I'm reading. And he says, what do you mean you're reading? I didn't hear anything. So that's right there. Augustine lived in the, died around early 5th century. So by the 5th century, the norm is still for people to read stuff aloud or to have it read to them aloud. And that's the way people experienced it. But in the oral period, everything has to be aloud because there is no text. The primary purpose of the hymn, of course, is to pray to a god or to praise the god, usually. So it's not really sort of, I mean, there is usually some sort of pro forma, oh, please bless me and my family, but there's not usually a specific request or ask in the hymns. Hesiod's hymn to the Muses praises them for inspiring his poetry and also sort of asks them to help him deliver his song. And the Muses are the daughters of memory, and an oral poet needs memory. The hymn to Hecate presents her as a protective goddess. So we don't really have the darker aspect of Hecate, which comes out in later stuff. Here we have they say it's Attic red figure. It's not really. This is sort of a mixed medium lekythos by the Achilles painter, showing a muse playing a lyre. And as you can see, this is a little bit smaller than that earlier instrument. This is what a lyre would look like. The other was bigger. It was a cithara. The catalogs. So we get the genealogy of the gods designed to be recited again. They're all of this stuff is read aloud. It describes the creation as a genealogy of the earliest gods. The poem presents two methods of procreation. There's spontaneous generation, so Gaia produces a bunch of kids before she's married, and then, of course, within marriage. And the movement towards procreation in marriage seems to be, among other things, a way of normalizing marriage. Marriage, of course, is a way to control female sexuality because women are not allowed to sort of have multiple partners. Men generally are allowed to have multiple partners. Here we have the inside of a black figure cup. So this would be like a wide cup, and it's got handles on the side, showing Eris. So Eris, Strife, is a winged figure here because Strife moves quickly. That's the idea. Dramatic tales. So the dramatic tales, basically the main overall arching story of the theogony is how Zeus came to power. That's really the deal. So we get the early stuff, but it leads up to Zeus winning, and Zeus is going to be in charge forever. And not only do we get Zeus sort of fighting to get power, but because he actually deals with chaotic figures like the giants and monsters, he shows that he deserves to be in power, right? So that's an important thing. He institutes marriage to control female reproduction, right? We do not want, because the giants that Zeus has to deal with are the children of Gaia alone. Uranus's testicles get cut off, blood drips, the blood hits Earth, Gaia, and she produces on her own. So this is not sexual reproduction. She produces from the blood the giants. So the giants are monsters. And in a sense, the subtext is, if women are left to their own devices, they're going to produce monsters. And so therefore, you don't want that to happen. And of course, he creates order and justice. So Hesiod does not present Zeus as necessarily a nice guy, but he presents him as a guy who's got a handle on things. And for Hesiod, coming out of the Dark Ages into this, tentative area of order in the 8th century, you can see why he might praise Zeus for that. So here we have Zeus defeating Typhoeus. This is a black figure vase. So the figures are black against an orange-like background. This is a little bit more elaborate, as it does have orange mixed into the reddish orange mixed in to the figures, but the figures themselves, their faces, their skin are black. If they're female, they would be white. But here we've got Typhoeus, who is a giant. Giants are often shown as having snaky bodies, as he does right here. And we know that this is Zeus fighting Typhoeus because it says Zeus, and over here somewhere it says Typhoeus. So we actually have the words that tell us. But the other thing that tells us this is Zeus, he's holding the thunderbolt, which looks like this weird party favor. It doesn't look like that's the zigzag thing we think of. Prometheus and Pandora. So this comes from the end of the Theogony. The last big story is the story of Prometheus helping humans out by giving them fire. And his motivation is not given by Hesiod. We don't know what Hesiod thinks. Hesiod presents him as a smart guy that tried to trick Zeus but failed. And humans are not as smart as Prometheus. Therefore, if humans try to fool the gods, they're going down. That's really sort of the big thing. So Prometheus, his name means forethought, so he can sort of see the future. The story of Prometheus and Pandora addresses both the institution of marriage and the idea of order in society. Marriage is mentioned in this story. I don't know if I would quite put it the way Maurizio has it here. Prometheus steals fire to benefit humanity, his creation. Well, yes and no. So we don't get in Hesiod that Prometheus created humans. Whether Hesiod believed that or not, we don't know. It's not in any of the works, so it's unclear. He does help the humans out, which does suggest some connection, but he does not explain it, and he doesn't really justify Prometheus' actions. Prometheus sort of tricks Zeus just because he's a trickster, and he likes to play tricks. And, of course, he gets a bit, by Zeus because he tricked him. Zeus punishes humans who get the fire by sending them Pandora. Now, in the Theogony, Pandora is not named. She is just woman, and the curse is that women are the curse. And the way women are the curse is women don't work like men work, and they depend on men. Of course, men set the society up so that women depend on them, but let's leave that aside. Women are presented here as parasites. Hesiod compares them to drones who eat up all the honey but don't do any of the work. Okay? That's not quite what happens with drones, but that's the way he presents it. And so here we have the creation of Pandora with Epimetheus, Hermes, and Zeus. So here is Hephaestus, who is got, you can tell it's Hephaestus. So I don't know, Hephaestus has got the hammer. Hephaestus is the one who creates Pandora. Here Pandora seems to be coming up out of the ground. This is Hermes. You can tell because he has the caduceus, the herald staff. He's got the helmet. This one has helmet with wings. It doesn't always have wings. And he's got the winged sandals on. He's a messenger, and he is going to take Pandora and give her to Epimetheus, Prometheus' dumb brother. Now, Epimetheus does not make an appearance in the Theogony. He does make an appearance in the Works and Days. All right. That will be it.